Hello everyone, my name is Haley and I'm a student of Dr. Clarence Trausch. This series of podcasts is going to include conversations with Dr. Trausch about his life and how his journey has led him to where he is now. Through this, in an autobiographical fashion, we're going to dive into stories that were memorable parts of his path in trying to put the pieces of the mosaic together to get a better understanding at how he has evolved to where he is today. This project is an offering with the intention to make a record of his life to inspire those of us who are also on this path. Chapter 1. Childhood. So, your childhood. I'm curious about to what extent what happened to you as a child and the way you were brought up influenced your life. And the way that you thought about life. Did you have a heightened perspective on it, or did you feel like you were kind of just like everyone else?
At the time, I don't think there was any thinking about that kind of thing, any heightened perspective or awareness of that. I just had these natural inclinations when I was little to be interested in the mystical, in the magical, and I was. So I wandered around as a kid playing with things that were more magical. I had a magic set, I had a chemistry set, and I enjoyed those things that related to science and magic. Same thing I do today, as well as the adventures of life.
So, you said you didn't really think about it, but did you have any type of idea about what life was like or what you wanted your life to be like?
Not really until I was about 13 or 14 when I began to ask hard questions. The questions that people ask today that are philosophers and scientists. These questions were occurring when I was, as I said, 12, 13, 14. Living on a farm, the only access I had was to the Bible. That's all there was. I wasn't near any library, never went to a library. The only library was the school and the books that were assigned by teachers. So my interest in mysticism and in magic and in thinking had to be satisfied with religion. And so I started to read the Bible. That's when I began to ask harder questions and realized slowly, gradually, that I wasn't doing the things that the other kids were doing. Even though I was still having adventures with them, I was quietly and secretly, from my parents and from my friends, seeking a higher kind of knowledge. I didn't think about it at the time. I didn't think that's what I'm doing. It was just, I gotta know. And I started with the Bible, and I started with local priests and asking them very hard questions that they could not really answer.
When they couldn't answer your questions, were you kind of just like, oh, okay, or were you somewhat dissatisfied?
I was completely dissatisfied. I never was a kid that was annoyed by these kind of things. I was just dissatisfied. It wasn't good enough. So I thought I'd study myself more, and I did. I studied the Bible. Turns out studying the Bible, reading Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Judges and all those early books was a sad, sad thing for me. It portrayed an angry, disturbed God. By that time, I was turning 17, 18, and leaving high school and not going to college, thinking. I was thinking. And I spent the next year and a half after high school working and thinking about what I was going to do to get these questions answered. I didn't really know. So I started to do some research on it. I started to look more deeply into theology and religion and found that there were things other than the Catholic Church, the Catholic Sunday Mass. There were monks that studied this stuff all the time. When I found that out, I began to pursue a relationship with these monasteries and see what it was like to be a member of them and what the learning would be like. That began to satisfy me immensely.
So, going back to when you were a child, did you feel excited about life? And did you feel like there was a purpose to it? I see a lot of people today that are growing up with this kind of existential dread. Was it like that when you were growing up?
No.
Was there ever desire not to live.
No, there was no such desire not to live. There was an awareness that this wasn't very meaningful. And so, because I didn't have any answers and nowhere to go to ask them, again, living on a farm, teachers didn't know. So I entertained myself with, again, adventure, hunting and fishing and shooting and sports, and entertained myself with those kinds of things while I secretly studied, as I said, secretly studied philosophy. Didn't know it was philosophy at the time, but was secretly studying that. When I say secretly, I do not mean I was hiding it from anyone, but I was not telling anybody about it.
You were just doing it on your own. I was
just doing it on my own, and there was nobody in my world that would have been interested in talking about these things, including my surrogate father and girlfriend and friends would never have been interested in these kinds of things.
From what I understand, your home life, a lot of people would say it was difficult or challenging because your father was an alcoholic and your mother was somewhat removed. Do you think that growing up like that and having so many siblings and being in a somewhat toxic environment had anything to do with motivating you for a meaningful life? Or was it just, this is what it is and I'm moving on?
No, even though my dad was an alcoholic, severe alcoholic, and was not really present, I don't know that it affected me that much in terms of hating life. I don't think that was the case. I was enjoying myself. In fact, occasionally my dad would recognize something I was doing, show a little bit of interest in it for himself, and then disappear again. There was nothing that he could sustain except the alcohol.
Looking at that now, it's easy to understand, but when you were going through that, were you ever disappointed that your parents weren't more loving? And
I don't remember any disappointment. I remember thinking, I'm going after what I want. And the things that I'm doing will lead me to an answer. An important statement that I have never thought about making, you're squeezing me into making, and that is, I didn't belong there, and I didn't belong to them. I belonged to myself, and I was alone in this world. A. B. It wasn't lonely. I filled my world with interesting things to be and do and fantasize upon, and lived that life. I had my next brother was my brother was 3 years younger than me, and my sister's next sister's 6 years younger than me. They appeared too during these years. I didn't show any interest in them. It wasn't that I didn't like them or they were bad or something. I just had my own world I lived in, and that was it.
So to me it sounds like if you were to personally answer the question nature versus nurture and how it affected your life, it sounds like you in your entire life had somewhat of an inner drive that motivated you, and that no matter what was going on around you, it didn't hinder you or even push you. It was just kind of all dependent on you.
It was. Nature was clearly operating in me and overwhelmed nurture, there wasn't very much nurture. But there wasn't an awareness. I did not have an awareness that, poor me, there's really no nurture except those times when there were toxic statements and fights and so forth that were just horrible, and I ran away from them. I would run away.
Can you remember any specific incident where something like that happened and it provoked an insight?
Well, there were a lot of those. I don't remember most of them, but for an example would be where my mother would be raging about not getting things done in time, and raging to us kids about how stupid we were and not fulfilling her needs, and hurting because of that, because of the name calling. Not hurting so much because she was distressed. I didn't understand why she couldn't handle it, or why they couldn't handle it, but hurt because of the accusations and the name calling. And I remember an incident where I went outside and I took my dog. I had a little shepherd, German shepherd type dog. I sat down with her and I cried because I hurt from these accusations, and I told her, I whispered in her ear, I said, I will never, never, never call you or any animal stupid, ever. And we sat there and she cried with me, so to speak, and we cried and got it all out and then went on. The next morning I got up and went out looking to go on my hike in the morning before school, and so I was back again. So there were incidents like that. As I got older, there was less and less connection. I wasn't home much. I was out on my own or with my friends.
I mean, there's a lot to be said for you being a child and seeing your mother and the people around you so stressed out. And you said you didn't understand why they were that way. Like, you didn't understand why it stressed them out so much. And I feel like that's a really advanced perspective.
Yes, I guess it is, because I projected on them that if they changed their way of looking at things, they changed their behavior according to those changed perspectives, it would be much easier to live life. And of course, you find that that's what I'm doing in teaching today. I wind up doing that with everybody.
That's what I was going to say. I can see the direct connection between that and what you're doing now.
Yes, and that wasn't something that was so much learned, although I have to give that credit. There was a lot of unconscious shifts that took place that may be representative of things they did that helped shape me in terms of nurture. But the nature was already there that said, fix it. Let's just do it. Let's get it done. I used to go back on the farm. There was a shed on the farm that nobody used. I went into that shed and I turned it into a magic boat that I sailed around the world with. I was seeking adventure. I was seeking the learning, the education, the insights I would get by sailing around the world and learning how to live and learning how to be strong. So in a way, that was entirely different than my father, completely different. He was suffering from not knowing what to do with himself and the disappointment that life was for him. And my mother just, the word for her is harried, stressful and harried. And so I had almost nothing to do with my mother and my father. I just lived, and I was more of a ghost, and I liked it. I stayed that way, and I liked it. And they really pretty much ignored me and left me alone.
Did you ever feel guilty for having such a developed inner life and contentment that you felt bad for them, that you weren't connecting with them more?
Early on, it was more like my fault and my flaw, my vice was that I didn't understand why, what was wrong with you, can't you see this? Even when I left home for the monastery, it was the same. What's wrong with you, can't you see? Change your life. I didn't say, look, I'm doing it. I didn't think that way. Look, it can be done, I'm doing it. I just did it and looked back over my shoulder and looked at that situation and said, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just change your life?
Why aren't you doing it too?
Why aren't you well, I didn't think that way. Why aren't you doing it too? Just why aren't you doing it? Not why are you doing it? Look what I'm doing. Why aren't you doing it? I never had that idea. I never had that hubris. It was like, I'm just going my way. Why don't you find a way? I wasn't thinking about showing them a way or teaching them a way. It seemed to me perfectly obvious that if you disciplined your life would be better.
You could be happier.
Yeah, you could be happier. And of course, that's, again, a metaphor for my work today. If you change your life a little bit, you can be happier. And if you change it a little more, you can be even happier. And there's no end. And that's one big secret that people don't know. There isn't a topping out of this happiness.
It can just keep getting better. It sounds like you have always just had a very developed and stable inner life. And it's just changed with you as you've learned more, but
I've added to it, or it's been added to and expanded. But the core is still there. The young hunter, the 10-year-old hunter, the 10-year-old chess player. Who's that, you know? He hunts, he plays chess, he does magic, he studies the Bible.
He asks hard questions.
He asks hard questions of people who should know the answer to those questions.
Quickly, what was one of the things that you asked?
Many things I asked, but one of them showed up graphically that turned me at 10, turned me in a significant way. I asked a priest that was teaching religious studies to the community why the Bible said, and he was teaching, that the world was just 5,000 years old and had begun with Adam and Eve, when we know that the earth is older than that, and that the dinosaurs lived 165 to 65 million years ago. And he corrected me and said that was false, and that there were no such thing as dinosaurs that lived that long ago, and that science was wrong. That was one of many pivotal points in my life. And I didn't condemn this father, this priest, for that. I just thought, oh, he doesn't really know anything. Wow.
See, a lot of children would be like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. But you knew something was different.
I knew that was completely wrong. And that, although I saw him as an old man then, he was in his 50s, that I thought something was wrong with him. I didn't think, you're just wrong. I thought, something's wrong with you, Father. Wow. And so that example of some of the things that happened, that illustrates the way I was. I had an even more completely solid resolve then that I was going to find these answers.